Hey everyone, we have today our CFO panel, and I have to tell you that I am very, very excited and honored to have the three chosen CFOs because they were chosen specifically based on their experience, having managed through various crises, um, managing various sized companies from small to very large that have gone from nothing to a really significant exit. So we've got a really great diverse panel, and I think it's really important that we have that. And this is the time, having as a founder, CEO, I think back when I was doing it, we didn't call anybody a founder. But I went through, I think, 8 different crises in my various engagements. And the reason that today is so important is I remember having had those sleepless nights. I remember the anxiety. I remember having to switch out of one pair of pajamas into another pair of pajamas around 3:30 in the morning because I just wasn't sure how in God's name I was going to get to the other side of the crisis. And what I was hoping to do today is help you through that, because I do truly understand the anxiety, the anguish, but also the opportunity. Because when balanced well, when you manage through a crisis and you start to see the other side, you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, because there are moments in time where you don't know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You don't even know you're in a tunnel, it's so dark. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from really understanding how you can manage in the depth of a crisis and some of the tools there, some of the things that are very creative approaches to managing your costs and whatnot, but then also positioning to come out the other side. So that really is the program that we wanted to host for you today. And what I thought I would do is I would have each one of our panelists talk a little bit about their background for 2 to 3 minutes and kind of share what they're bringing to this discussion, because as you will learn, they're all very unique and very different, and also very, very experienced, wise, and successful. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll start with Alia, and then we'll go to John, and then we'll go to Elena, and I'll let you guys just hand off to each other.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction. So nice to see everybody. Super excited to be here. A bit about myself is I started out in public accounting, what seems like many, many years ago now. I started out in a medium-sized firm, so that means I was exposed to tax, audit, small business tax planning, basically everything under the sun within accounting. And about 7 years ago, I left public accounting to get into industry. That's when I joined StackAdapt. It is a startup here in Toronto in ad tech space. And I was their first financial hire. I set up their entire finance department, and we went through a few rounds of fundraising with them. And definitely I learned a ton about sort of managing change and ebbs and flows of startups. And about 3.5 years ago, I left StackAdapt to join Endy, mainly because I needed a mattress. And Endy's been a wild ride. We sold the company about 1 year and a bit ago. So definitely that was an interesting experience. In addition, I built out that finance team also from scratch, similarly to StackAdapt. And now that it falls under the Sleep Country umbrella since the sale, we still continue to manage it and operate the company separately from Sleep Country. So I oversee finance, operations, customer experience, legal, and HR. So my scope of responsibilities only increased since the sale. And that's a bit about me. This COVID experience has been, again, life-changing. So we're trying to figure out how our business changes as everything in the market changes. And I hope I can help you guys out in any way I can.
John?
Thanks.
Well, I guess, like Joe, I'm one of the older folks, and sort of look at the number of things I've been through and the number of sleepless nights. So I've been a software entrepreneur for 20 years. I started out just in time for the internet bubble, and I was lucky enough, to have the full experience of going from 60 people in a company unable to pay rent to selling it for 1.2 billion on Feb 29th, 2000, to the brutal collapse of the market afterwards. And in that afterwards part, I actually helped a buddy start a startup. And again, for those of you who didn't live it, it was absolute nuclear winter in the technology space in Toronto, post the internet bubble. And, so we started a company in 2002, and it was, it took 13 years before he was able to exit that. I ended up helping another friend start something that I joined in 2009 at the very depths of the financial recession, and had to do a financing. Actually, I closed it in June 29th, or June of 2009. So I've been through a lot of cycles, and I say to people, because I get called all the time about, what's it like being an entrepreneur? And I go, well, my personal low point was having 2 weeks of cash. My dad died. My mom had a heart attack when she was being told my dad was dying. So this COVID thing, I kind of go, you know what? You have to expect one of these every 10 years and just govern yourself accordingly. So I was brought in to be the grumpy old guy on the call.
Oh, Elena?
Yeah, hey guys, really excited to have everyone join us today. So a bit about myself. Similar to Alexandra at Endy, I started my career in public accounting as well. I was at Ernst & Young for the first 3-4 years of my career. Focused a lot on large mining and commercial real estate businesses, lots of travel, cool travel, exciting times. But at the end of that, I decided to join a startup. It was self-funded, so completely bootstrapped, a business to consumer, a beauty subscription box. And I joined in an operations first role, and finance sort of got tacked on afterwards. I haven't lived through as many economic ups and downs, but definitely as a business in Luxbox, which was that B2C startup, we lived through a ton of ups and downs and near-death experiences, managing for a week to a month of runway left and trying to figure things out from there. And after Luxbox, a few of us from that team started a company called Exact Media. Was a co-founder and COO. And that is a business-to-business platform for ad tech space as well, similar to StackAdapt, where that allows advertisers to connect with e-commerce retailers to distribute physical media, so paper inserts, gift cards, coupon samples. And we sold that business in December of 2019, so a few months ago. I took a couple of months off afterwards, and I started at Next as COO just this past March. So I had a week in the office before COVID happened, and we went home.
Yeah, talk about trial by fire. Oh my gosh, I feel so guilty, so terrible, but fortunately, Elena had a little bit of time off to do all kinds of ways to creatively express herself, from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to being down at in Vegas for CES. And it was just, I feel terrible. She comes back from all of that, and sure enough, we go into both a financial crisis and a pandemic. But I mean, what better way to get to know your team and the financials of your company than coming into that firestorm? So I thought where I would start is, on the more gut-wrenching stuff, managing cash flows and how far ahead you're trying to govern cash flow management so that you've got that sustainability. And as you're trying to predict the length of a crisis and how you manage through that crisis, what are the time horizons that you like to work with that give you that sense of comfort that you've got it and you're going to be able to manage through this type of a crisis? And I'll leave it to any one of you to go ahead first. All right, John, you're up because you've gone through more crises. I'm letting you
Okay.
go first.
You know, it's funny because in my mind, there's not a hard and fast answer. And I would say when I was younger, I would have said 1 year. In my ideal world, being a finance person, I always look at it as I'm one end of the spectrum, the founder CEO is the other end. I would always love a year because that's more than enough runway to get a financing done. The fact that I alluded to, I've almost run out of cash multiple times is a comment to how unsuccessful I've been in being a counterweight. And so, I would try and plan for a year. And this one is more interesting because I almost think you have to start with multiple scenarios and time frame, right? Because it's a crapshoot as to, is this going to be a V, a W, a very angled J, slow, grindingly painful recovery? If you look at the scale of job losses, it's not clear that this will be like some of the others. Having said that, there's lots of money still in existing funds. So, my gut is 6 months to a year preferably, because I personally think this is, depending on what sector you're in, going to be longer and more grinding than what we're used to. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Okay, Alia?
Sure. So sorry, was that me, Joe?
No, it was Alia, but I'll come to you next, I promise.
Similar names. Yeah, I agree with John. I don't think there is a one clear answer on how long to project for, whether it's cash flows or forecasting overall. I think obviously my approach hasn't changed much in terms of doing cash flows. I think do them, but don't get lost in them, because at the end of the day, you're looking to your cash flow to figure out what should I do differently, what should I do next in my business. So once you're done that cash flow, you're really looking to figure out, well, now that I see it, what am I going to do? What can I do now that's going to be different? And you can project for every possible scenario, but the truth is, I don't think anyone knows what the next couple of months or even this whole year holds for us. So I think if you don't, time is a scarce resource. So I think don't spend so much time trying to predict every scenario, and think about what would I do differently if I see different outcomes. And if you don't think that you would do much differently, then just focus on what you're going to do anyway, rather than planning for every possible thing, because you're not going to be able to. That's my way of looking at it.
Elena?
Yeah, going to echo some of the comments already, but I'd say, if you have 12 months as a startup, you're in a really, really good place. Most likely you're not going to, especially at an earlier bootstrap stage. So yes, do your cash flow analysis. What I like to do is sort of a most likely scenario based on what I know today, and a worst case scenario, and try to always be prepared for the worst case scenario, but hope for the better outcome. I'd say, yeah, you might be looking at, a couple of months right now in the bank, and the decisions you make are going to be very, very different. But again, just be prepared for the worst case scenario, change your outcomes, or change your what you do each day to manage in that direction. And if things go in a positive way, that's just a bonus in a way.
So let's do some scenario or role management or scenario analysis. I've had a number of calls with founders in the last 2 weeks that have said, I may have enough cash to get me to June or July. So we're talking 2 to 3 months. I'm going to talk specifically about which costs you might want to be creative about later. But if you were to say, to a CFO or a founder who's really only got 2 to 3 months of runway, is there anything, John, that you would look at and say, okay, here's an immediate triage that may really work for you, or here are 2 or 3 things I can think of?
Well, I mean, in my mind, the very first thing is, have they exhausted all the government intervention, right? It's unprecedented, the immediacy with which the government's putting out funds. Under the CEWS program, you can get 75% of the employees' pay, up to 57.4 paid. I know BDC is doing a relatively quick funding these days if you have a round where there's an existing lead, we're right in the middle of one right now that's getting done really quickly. I mean, they're both BDC and EDC are being extremely responsive and sympathetic to the environment. My bet is you're going to see the government will process shred claims way more quickly than they have. So I'd first start with, okay, in most businesses at the early stage, right, your number one cost is headcount. And surprisingly, in this case, the government's making it easy to lay off a chunk of it. You know, what we did back in 2002 when we were starting up was we just took no pay. We made sure the line people were paid. We also paid attention to culture, right? At the end of the day, people care primarily about being paid relatively fairly, but more importantly, doing really interesting work with good people. And so, you know, the very basic non-cash thing that people sometimes forget in an emergency is just that importance of making sure the culture bonds are tight, because they tend to get reflected with people tolerating periods without pay. Like this same startup, we had 3 months where we just told the staff, we can't pay you. We had a lead customer. They were having issues. They ended up coming through and paying everybody. But, you know, most times it's your headcount, your rent, you know, assuming you don't have a high gross margin type company where you're doing hardware, there you'd have to go to your vendors and go, look, your direct cost is probably 40 points on the dollar. You need to term this out and give me some runway so I can bring in revenue. But there's only 4 or 5 buckets in any company, right, that you can deal with.
And you know what, I'm going to use Alexandra's formal name. So Alexandra, what have you found? Just so there's never any confusion between you and Elena again. Maybe you can give advice to that founder that's got 2 to 3 months left.
Yeah, I think, again, to echo some of what John said, government funding, they've come out with quite a few things between loans and subsidies on wages. So that's probably a great first place to start. And then honestly, working with every vendor. I think there isn't an expense that's too small to try to decrease, whether it's increasing payment terms, whether it's working with, I know some credit card companies, not all unfortunately, but some credit card companies have actually become a little bit more lenient with their terms. Talking to your landlords, there's probably some sort of office expenses if you have an office that you could just remove completely, I don't know, cleaning, things like that. So I think there isn't, sometimes little expenses seem small and too small to tackle, but I think they add up. So sometimes getting some of those little ones out of the way can still help you add a couple months onto your runway.
Elena, you and I talked and worked through a whole bunch of different scenarios. What were 1 or 2 that you would advise some of our startups to think about?
Yeah, and perhaps I can sort of go back to when we were running Luxbox here and we had, 1 to 2 months runway, and the type of expenses that we would look at delaying, deferring. So government funding, obviously, it's already been talked about, but any vendor increasing payment terms, you'd be surprised when you actually are transparent and work with people how forward they can come. It's when you disappear and don't give any indication as to what's going to happen where you're met with a pushback. So we did a ton of that. We did, so for about 50% of our team, we paused salaries for the period of time until we were in a better runway spot. Fortunately, we were a very small team at the time. We were still under 15 people, and transparency, I think, is key when you're very open about what's happening and why certain decisions are being made. And so half the salaries were delayed, and we tried to do it as much to the leadership team as possible. So anyone that was basically running a piece of the company, we agreed collectively to just defer our salaries until we had a bit more of a runway. But salaries, rent, 2 big ones, and anything else, if you can push it out, it doesn't hurt to ask. A lot of times finance teams are wary about, because we know we want to collect on the other side, we're wary of asking others to push things out. And it's very, very important. And at the end of the day, the worst thing they can say is no. And then from there, you're going to decide, well, am I going to take that no and pay them? Or am I going to take that no and delay this even further because I need to survive as a company and deal with the consequences of it being escalated a little bit. And I'm not proud to say that we did have those types of situations where, vendors said, no, we have to get the payment. And we had to unfortunately delay it even further. And it got escalated. But that gave us an extra 2 weeks or 3 weeks to figure something out creatively on the revenue side to be able to pay that eventually. But if we had done that week, we would have probably been under the water the following week. So those are sort of my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, so I mean, listen, if it helps, I mean, we considered everything in the past and even in the most recent crisis that we're still managing through, going to 4-day work weeks or mandatory 1 day a week vacation time or anything that preserved that cash flow, going back to vendors and saying, okay, we're going to need a 2 to 3 month reprieve. We're going to come back, very strongly. But, and so having all those discussions we found really, really, really helpful. The other one that, I wonder about is as you think about your partners and people that are shareholders and stakeholders, to Elena's point, having that transparency, having that dialogue. One of the things that was so critically important in every single crisis was communication, communication, communication. Talking to everybody, making sure everybody knew with full transparency, as much as you were willing to offer, that this was our situation. Here's how we plan to manage through it. How can they step up and be a good partner, be a good, whatever the relationship was. And inevitably, and I don't know if this is a Canadian thing, inevitably, I found people wanted to stand beside you and deliver. The more honest you were, the more open you were, the more communicative you were. I found them really, really willing to oblige and not really go after you and try to gut you like a fish. And to that end, I guess maybe we can talk about raising funds in an environment like this, either from shareholders, changing your banking relationships or with your existing banking relationship. What are some of the ways to draw capital into your business, John, that you found that can be really, really helpful and might be good counsel for some of our startups?
I think it's time I go last, actually.
Okay, you'll go last next time. I think everybody just loves your backdrop.
Well, that I put out to the group, the meme is everything is fine. And I saw it on a FinTech webcast and I thought, I love a sense of humor. It was this or a nursing home I was going to put up. So
I think this is good.
So, I agree with Joe's comments on transparency. I've actually seen both in terms of how people treat it, and what this will give you is a measure of your existing investors, because some will drag it out to the last possible second and then lower their price of whatever the next round is. Others will step up and be square. And so the sooner you have those chats, the better, assuming if you're really bootstrapped or angel financed, it's really most of the people in your family, I always refer to it as my Christmas party conversations, because it's all people you know. And every year when you go to the family Christmas party, you get asked about, how's my investment doing anyways? I got to the stage at one point, I couldn't go to the gym because one of my neighbors would always ask me, why haven't you exited yet? So, you have to cast your net widely. There's some great resources now. Like, I like the fact Hockey Stick has put out its resource of here's all the funders, and you can slice it, currently active in Canada. Because I do think this, some of the stuff that BDC is doing with primarily Canadian-led funds, like $1 million and they each take a half, can get done quickly and help early stage stuff. If it's angels, it's really, talking to them and just saying, okay, what else can you do? So it really depends on where you are in your cycle. Banks, by and large, have been told, it's almost do what you can to support people. It just gets tough. If you have no revenue and no customer base, it's very tough for a bank to step up for it. What we're seeing surprisingly is EDC is also though useful. Again, if you have any revenue, it doesn't even have to be primarily foreign. I think they're drawing the line at about 10%, and they're underwriting, right? 5 million, up to 5 million. They have to have a Canadian bank doing the underwriting, but the bank's only in for a quarter. Their credit standards are ostensibly the same, but really they're not. They're more relaxed because they've been told, we want to get the money out and support people.
And so, Alexandra, do you have a take on this?
Hi, honestly, I haven't fundraised in quite a few years right now. So I don't want to muddy the waters and add something that's not of value. So I think do whatever you can. Keep in mind that this probably is temporary. So just because this is happening right now, it's possible that maybe you can make it out without fundraising right now, and maybe that'll be easier on you. So keep your options open that way. But in terms of who to go to and how to do it, I don't think I can add much value.
No. Elena, you and I have had discussions with a number of different founders and whether they should go to a warm partner or, and to John's point, this really is the time where you really get to see who has character, who is truly there for you, medium to longer term versus, you know what, they're in it in a shark-like fashion. But we've talked a little bit about raising capital and who's going to be there for you, and the importance of having those strong, warm relationships, because starting a cold discussion about fundraising is in this environment is it's just too hard, and your chances of rejection are north of 90%. But Elena, maybe you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'd say at this point, you're likely to raise from people you know. So if you've had conversations ongoing, keep on having them. The truth is, like, because everyone's going through this, you're not alone. You're not going through this tough time alone. And so investors know this, and they're seeing it, and they're going to see what's going to happen after the storm sort of passes, because we're all operating under this massive fog right now. So people who you know, continue fostering those. If you're in the middle of a race, keep at it, keep on going. I'd say don't stop any new conversations, just don't expect them to materialize in the next 6 months. The cool thing with this period right now is that all investors are, you know, they're at home, but they're still taking meetings. So this is an opportunity for you to get in front of people and have a conversation. But I've also heard the other side of it, that they've reserved their funds for now until things get a bit more clear for, you know, either their existing portfolios or people that they already know or they were in conversations with. So anyone new, I wouldn't expect anything much from, but I would want to start building that relationship. And again, this isn't like investor relations aren't one of those, I meet you and tomorrow you give me money, right? I see that as true relationship building. And so if I meet someone, even in normal circumstances, I don't expect to ask them for funding tomorrow or in a week or in a month. This is a relationship that's building. It's kind of like a friendship, because the last thing you want to do is take money from an investor you don't know, because they become such a big part of your company, right? So having gone through Series A in the past, the way you select your investors and what that means to your business moving forward, it's huge. So I would, like, as a founder, I would be so protective of my equity and only give it to an investor that I trust. And I'm not going to build that trust in a day or in a month. So I'd continue having new conversations, but in terms of tactically raising now, you're going to raise from people who you've already built relationships with. And if they're, you know, largely what I'm seeing is investors in Canada and in the US are being super helpful, and they're trying to continue promoting and helping entrepreneurs. And so if you have a good business model, they're going to be there to support you. Now, this is also going to be an opportunity for you to see if you don't have a good business model, because even your good contacts and, you know, warm investor relations that you have, you might be forced to make a tough decision on a business model at this point too. and it's like your baby, and you know, we had to pivot our business several times, and it was this tough realization that something is off with my model. Maybe it's not like the investor, it's me. So that's my sort of overall, but definitely warm, focus on warm, continue the cold though.
Yeah, and I just wanted to top that up a little bit. I mean, one of the things we ended up doing back in 2002 with the one company was we actually subbed out our employees to another friend who was busy. So, you know, because some companies are busy right now. And so we ended up doing PS, professional services gigs, for about a year of people that we both knew were good at development. We put them out to a friend's company. It covered their cost and kept them tied to us, and we brought them back in a year later. And then, you know, conversely with Quick Play, we were trying to do a D2C mobile video service in 2009, and our US competitor had raised 90 million, we had raised 9. When we looked at the industry economics, we said, well, this is just stupid, right? At the end of the day, the carriers like AT&T spend billions and billions and billions on content. What we should do is just white label it. We completely flipped the product because the environment forced us to, and went from D2C to white label plumbing in a B2B world. And that became the whole business.
See, that's where I want to go next. Like, let's talk about, okay, you're in a crisis, you're in a crunch. How do you think creatively about your business model? How do you think about managing for the future? Was the model that you had the right model, or given the new information, is it time to pivot, or is it time to, depending on how early stage you are, to move away? This was a yesterday discussion, move away from your model and rebuild a new model. Like, let's talk about that, and then let's talk about future revenues as well. So do you, any of the three of you have any thoughts on, you know, adjusting businesses to adapt to this new information and truly have that fungibility?
So maybe I can jump in. If you really believe in your model and you think this is just the storm that's passing, but you're stuck with like a 1 to 2 month runway and you're going to be screwed, you have to be prepared to make some really tough decisions. And when I say tough, it's not around cost. Like, you're going to have to get really creative around revenue if you're in a revenue generating phase. So in our scenario, we believed in the model still, but we were stuck with a business that only had, you know, another few weeks left. So some of the decisions that we made would have, if we weren't fully transparent with our team, would have seemed really off. So as an example, we never discounted our pricing because we were a luxury product. But faced with this runway crunch, we had to make a decision to, well, we're going to discount now heavily to be able to pre-sell annual memberships so that we can, you know, last through the next month. And we'll deal with the consequences of that in 3, 4, 5 months. But today we're going to make this decision that's going to hurt our branding a little bit. And how can we compensate for that? That was like one sort of a thing we did. Another was we were working with prestige beauty brands only. So this is, you know, your Yves Saint Laurents and Armani's and Lauders. But we made a decision to accept a proposal from a mass brand at the time to pay us quite a bit to have their product included in our boxes. So that was both, like, it was financially, it helped us increase runway, but we knew it's gonna hit our relationships short term with some of the prestige brands that we were putting this mass brand aside. So they were like, at the time, they were such tough decisions because we knew we were gonna short-term sacrifice something with our brand for the sake of lasting through the next 2 months. So those were like a couple of examples of things we had to do creatively on both, you know, discounting and the revenue side to collect up front. And, you know, sometimes making a decision to work with a partner that in an ideal world, we wouldn't have had in our business, but we chose to do it so that we could survive.
Terrific. Now, I do want people to start sending in questions because I just wanted to get the discussion going. This is really for our audience. This is for the founders, the finance people, anybody out there that have questions that they're dying to ask. Because I mean, this really is a very you know, experienced and wise panel, and they've seen all this. So please send those questions in so that I can ask them, because again, we don't want this to be a one-dimensional show. Maybe some of the other folks can talk about some of the creative things that they've seen to draw revenue in. Like I've been hearing a little bit about the restaurant business going out and doing their version of an online or takeout Summerlicious, or going to those, you know, great customers that you have, and you know, basically getting them to give you advanced revenue at 70 cents on the dollar. Maybe you can talk about some of the things that you've seen, whether it's from you and your company, like Sleep Country, or what you've seen or heard that you were like, you know what, that was brilliant. That was absolute brilliance. I mean, applaud, you know, kudos to that person. Alexandra, John?
Sure, I can jump in quickly. So I definitely think that this is the time to pivot, especially depending on where your runway is. One thing I wanted to mention is I think probably everybody in this group is much more experienced and ready to pivot. And keep in mind, there's so many businesses that have been around for so much longer that have never faced this kind of situation. And so you have a bit of a leg up in a way on a more traditional business who's not used to things changing so quickly and actually having to change with the conditions, the environmental conditions. One thing that I thought was helpful to us in most cases is just identifying what that item is that's preventing you from operating, and seeing if there's anything kind of like what Elena has mentioned, is there anything you can do to get over that? So is there a factory that's closed that you can move to a different factory? Is there a delivery partner that's not working that you could work with some other business who does have delivery that doesn't have, I don't know, maybe inventory, something like that? A lot of people are have these barriers, and a lot of people's companies, barriers are different. So perhaps identifying a company that you think you could benefit from and they could benefit from you, and sort of teaming up that way could be useful. Yeah, I think that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. John?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, again, there are a number of companies that have done very well that started in 2009. And I just mean in Canada, where older, larger, staler companies had an asset and didn't know what to do with it and sold it, which in my mind isn't a pivot, but being open to looking at stuff that is a casualty of the current circumstance and repurposing it is, you know, one way. We ended up, you know, we were partnered with Qualcomm at one stage. They had built out, they were going to do mobile broadcasts throughout the US with a dedicated chip. And it turned out the money they had put into Spectrum was worth way more than what they had built. And so they shut the unit. We were lucky enough to be able to do a deal with them where we bought an option on their facility. It was a full broadcast facility. And we bought an option for a year for a relatively small amount. Our investors were actually up their exposure so that we could do it. And we went out and sold it because we had a completely different purpose in mind. And we went to a large carrier and said, we can run 200 channels for you, live streaming for a low fixed price and just a variable fee. And it was just because we could see there was this, they were going to sell it for scrap, right? When you sell scrap, it gets nothing. There's another company here that I know, you know, was bought for $7 million in 2009 in the software space. It's now about a $500 million valuation company. And it's just because the astute entrepreneur saw they weren't making the most of it and had a vision. So, I mean, you know, that's the one end of the spectrum. And, you know, the other end is just, you know, can you pivot, as I talked about, your heads? Your people are usually your best resource. How can you repurpose them, even if it's transitory, so you can fight a year from now?
So here's a question, and it's from Mahan. My question is, how do you, I need transitional lenses, but how do you minimize the risk of employees leaving after hearing that they might not be able to get paid during these uncertain times? John mentioned that culture is an important prerequisite, and I would love to hear more strategies on keeping employees motivated to stay.
Yeah, I mean, there in my mind, we talked about it earlier. I think transparency matters, but I also think it's a balancing act. And you almost have to look at your employee base and say, where in their life are they? Because if you have a bunch of fresh graduates, say 22 to 27, they likely don't have a mortgage, they don't have kids. If your employees are in their 30s, they may have one or both. And the risk sensitivity has to be measured first. And if you have them in their 30s and they're more risk averse, you try and keep that sort of level. The founders basically go without pay in a lot of circumstances, and the management team, or with partial pay only. The employees are blind to whether or not you're filing under SUS for it, right? Because you do it through CRA on your source deductions if they're actually employees. So as far as they know, they're being paid their pay. And when I said culture is important, it's usually people want to do interesting, neat work. Like a quick play, if you were to think about what cell phone you had in 2007, you would not picture doing mobile video on it. And, but it was a really neat technology challenge because the handsets were so compute constrained. And so, the people who stayed with us really were in love with the thought of getting to what we now all have everywhere.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, the massive innovation in the last decade. Alexandra?
Yeah, so since taking over HR, I've been surprised about how few people are actually motivated by pay alone. So while certainly an important aspect of why people are coming to work or starting work at home, I think that the key is just identifying what everybody is motivated by and seeing what you can do to give them that. So I think most people, especially working with people they like, about doing interesting things and figuring out how whatever it is that they're working on right now is going to progress their career in the future. So really helping them through that and showing them what their career is going to look like because of this is, I think, a big motivating factor for a lot of people. And there's also stock options.
Yeah, so I mean, to that end, I'll ask this question and then I'll offer a thought that I got from a founder yesterday. So how do you manage founder salaries when the focus is to pay your employees as much as possible during the crisis? And I think, well, I'll tell you what, I'll let you guys answer because I heard a little bit, but I think it's important that this is reinforced because it is, one of the things that you're shouldering as a founder is that responsibility for all those stakeholders, your employees being a fairly significant one.
Maybe I can start here. So first, if you're pretty early stage, the team you have around you is like your war team. These are people who are like your family, and at least in our case, we were super, super transparent with them because they were all our friends at that point. We weren't just working together, we were building something big together. So there's a ton of transparency. And as the leadership team, or as the sort of founder and departmental leads, or call it whatever, as we sat down, our goal was to make sure that everybody else gets paid first. So at our level, we literally did this on Excel. We individually put down all our necessary expenses for the month. And each of us were like, this is what I need to literally not to default on my rent, to pay for groceries, to do this, this, and this. And it was sort of weird. Like, I think back to the time, that was almost 10 years ago, to be that transparent with a work team. But we literally laid out all our expenses and we're like, this is what I need to just survive so that I can keep coming to the office. And we dropped all our pays to that level. Our next would have been probably just like letting ourselves go or going on, I have, at some point, I wasn't even founder at this point. I was just part of the startup, but I really believed in the company. I took out my line of credit for 3 months. I lived off of my line of credit so that my salary could be delayed, so that my 2 team members continued getting paid. And it was a tough decision because I didn't have exit prior to, I didn't have anything to fall back on. But to John's point, I was very high risk tolerant at that time because I had no real life responsibilities. Unlike today, where, you know, I have a mortgage, so I can't really be that frivolous with my time. So who your team is very, very important. But as founders, like, we wouldn't even think twice before dropping our salaries to zero to not touch our teams, and we would be super, super open about that. And with the current environment, I think there's some room on the government assistance side, where normally as a founder, as a director, you wouldn't get EI or paid for anything. I think there might be opportunities today to get some government assistance if you literally temporarily let yourself go so that you don't let go of your employees. So that's sort of my take on that.
But sorry, for clarity, you can claim, it doesn't matter if you're a founder or not, you can claim under the CEWS, the CEWS program, right? For up to 75% of 57,400, right? And they just, as long as you don't play games where you move a non-arm's length employee from one company that hasn't had a revenue fall to another company that has, because then the CFO gets done personally, because the CFO has to personally attest to the accuracy. But yeah, there's, I agree with you, Elena, there's way more available than there ever was, so you could at least subsist for a period of time.
Yeah, and again, some of those creative, I touched on it earlier, you know, taking one mandatory vacation day a week, and as it gets more punishing, if it should go on a long time, I'm not suggesting this for a second, you know, 2 days a week. You know, there are so many different creative ways that you can manage through a crisis like this. But to the earlier point from John, where you have different people at different points in time of their life cycle, or where they are in terms of their outside responsibilities. You know, I've seen some companies that have said, you know, it's your choice. You can get paid either at 100%, 75%, 50%, or zero, and we're going to make it up to you in options. And so those are some of the, I mean, really, really super creative companies are doing whatever it takes, because the first thing you have to do is to survive. And you can survive without crucifying your relationships, whether it's your landlord or your coffee vendor or whomever. There are creative ways to get around this, especially if you believe, as I do, that this is going to be a shorter term horizon, and we're going to start staging back into work, back into community, back into society in the next 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, as you're starting to see in Germany, as you're starting to see in Denmark, as you're starting to see in New Zealand. I guess the other thing that I wanted to touch on was, if in fact Dr. Fauci just before this call came out and said, you know, sure, it's been horrible and awful, but it's easing up now, and there's the potential for another period of negativity or volatility if no vaccine has been found and proven and applied for, permit to be used in society by the fall. We're going to have this window, and call it, for the sake of argument, June to October. What is a founder to do if they were on, you know, 3-4 months runway? Do you believe that there will be that window, and should that window be used to go out and either raise capital, raise debt, or raise something to prepare for the possibility of another round this fall? And I'll just throw that out there, and then there's some other really good questions that have just come in.
I mean, I can jump in. So I'm sure you've heard it a million times over the past 4 or 5 weeks. Cash is king. It is, and your cash is king. So whatever way you can get money in, you want to do that. And the window is a perfect opportunity. Again, it's probably going to be from a warm lead, but like, this is when you have to step back, and if you truly believe in your business model, if your mentors and your advisors believe in your business model, and you think this is just a storm you have to weather through, then use that window to get as much cash in as possible, whether it's like cheaper lines of credit, government assistance, whatever it is. You want to sort of build up that war chest for money. And if you can do that through between June and October, you want to do that, because I do think there's probably going to be another wave until there is a vaccine, and how we collectively handle a second wave is probably going to decide how well we do and like how well the economy does getting out of this, because this has been a huge hit, right? I don't think our economy, our Canadian, even the government can handle supporting businesses and people in the same way that they have in the last month and a half another time this year. I don't think that's going to be feasible for them. So how we prepare for it is going to be super important, and get whatever cash you can into your bank accounts at this point.
Other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Elena. There's only so much we can blow up the deficit. And so you do have to be conscious of that, that there may not be as much largesse the next time. You know, they may in the future say, well, you had no notice in the first wave. You should have been prepared for the second wave. And so you do go, yeah, if the window's open at all, like my number one rule is if the ducks are quacking, feed them. And it's probably worth investing some time now. Like, you know, if you think of life as you make a small number of bets that have low probability about payout, but if they do, they have a fat tail distribution. It's probably worth starting calls now, because as Elena said earlier, right? If you don't have relationships, they're likely not going to fund immediately. But there's so many funds that have funds still to invest that it's probably worth taking some of your day and just making cold calls to associates at US funds that specialize in seed and Series A, depending where you are in your life cycle, so that if they're opening up for business in the summer, they actually know of you, right? Like it really is a question of where in your life cycle are you. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that a CFO's number one job isn't accounting, it's helping raise money. And that I have always underinvested in that. And I've just arbitraged by picking companies that have revenue. So it's honestly worth, you know, a half an hour every third or fourth day of making cold calls to funds now in the States, because they tend to be larger and more likely, right, to execute. They're not as loyal as Canadian. So you have to pick the bed you're going to sleep in. But it's worth investing the time, because, you know, your worst case scenario is obviously it's nothing. Well, it's a half an hour every third day, whatever, right? Your best case is it gives you a good mark to market, so that when you do have a local fund, that they can maybe partner, or you can use it to make sure there's better pricing integrity in the deal. Because the opposite is, you know, if you have too much home country bias, you don't get a fully priced asset. So yes, I would spend some time and be prepared to raise more money in the summer.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, there was a great book years ago called Fill Your Bucket Long Before You Need a Drink. And that is exactly what has to happen. And to be fair, I mean, this is an unprecedented time for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is venture capital funds are flush with cash. You know, OMERS is sitting at 700 plus. Radical's got, I think, over 300 in cash. Georgian just did $1 billion raise. Sequoia and Dries and Graybrook all did raises in the last 24 months. So there is cash there. And if you have had those discussions, you have that pre-existing relationship, those are pools of cash. But again, to come back to the original point, absolutely go to those people who know you, who trust you, that you've been open and honest with, and you've shown that you are credible. Because again, there are a lot of companies that in this crisis are going to buckle, or they're going to show colors that their investors wish they didn't see. And there are going to be those of character that the investors like, I'll put money behind you no matter what, because I love how you've governed yourself or managed yourself, held yourself accountable in this really, really tough time. Hang on, I just want to get to a couple more questions before we close off. Anthony, technology is a crucial factor in pivoting towards the future. How would you go about getting those who aren't fans of technology to accept or implement a digital strategy?
I'll jump in. We've done this a lot. I think the key is just getting people's buy-in. So for me, I feel like one-on-one works a lot better than in large groups because everyone's going to have something they don't like about the technology, and getting a big mob mentality of everything that they hate about it isn't going to be necessarily productive. So the way I do it is I introduce whatever it is that we're going to change to people within reason on a one-on-one basis, and sort of try to get them excited about why this is going to benefit them and what they're going to get to do that's actually more interesting in their life because of this technology. So I'm taking away these boring tasks from you, because usually that's what technology does, in lieu of you now having to use this new tool or having to implement this new digital strategy. So I think there is a way to spin everything, and without it being dishonest, to show everybody how some change is going to benefit them.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one before I ask the next question?
Well, just super quickly, I think the coolest thing about what we're going through right now, ignoring all the bad stuff, is that everyone is so open to change. Like, behaviors are changing drastically. My parents never ever ordered groceries online, and they're ordering stuff online. So from at all age categories and businesses as well, they're going to change the way we operate. So this is a perfect time to kind of capitalize on that openness to change in behavior. And you better believe it that people or businesses are not gonna operate the same way. No matter how much of a normal we go back to, it's not gonna be the same. I bet you Zoom calls over travel are gonna become more of a thing, et cetera, et cetera. There's gonna be a ton of stuff, but I think mentally we're all open to things a lot more right now. So I keep that sort of mindset around it, because you also have to sell yourself on it first before you can sell anyone else, otherwise they'll know.
Okay, so the next question was going to be, how do you acquire new talent and do recruitment in this environment? And John French quite rightly pointed out that one of my last meetings before we went into lockdown was with Marianne Bolger at Prospect, and she has created an incredible resource for attracting talent and for people looking for new roles. So I'm just going to put that out there. Because I do want to close off this call on a positive note or something more creative and interesting. And she's a very passionate entrepreneur. So do reach out to Marianne at Prospect and her team. But I liked where you were going, Elena. When you think about the changes to business as we know it in the future, it is changed forever. What are some of the changes that you've seen, Alexandra, that you think are definitely cast in stone and we're not going to go back, or it's certainly going to change the way business is conducted as you see it?
I mean, e-commerce has changed forever. We've seen our demographic change. We were fairly evenly distributed between most demographics, but we definitely see a lot more older folks buying now than ever before. So obviously people are just getting more and more comfortable with e-commerce, and I don't think that's going to go away. I think it was always heading in that direction, and this COVID-19 just sped up what was kind of inevitable. So I don't mean that retail is going to completely die off, but I think that more and more people have become now much more comfortable with online shopping and delivering and all of that, and that's here to stay forever.
John?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny, right? Who'd have thought we'd be doing this? The whole Zoom, when you look at its subscriber growth, I mean, I kind of looked at this question and went, how can you be in this industry and not be a fan of digital? As somebody who used to sell software face-to-face, because we sold to carriers. And, going forward, I know it's going to be way more, we won't fly to Japan. We'll do a video call to start with. You can do demos now with so little latency, right? Because it used to be in the old days, you'd have to bring a big friggin' box with you to do a demo because there was too much latency trying to do a demo in Hong Kong, for example, when we were doing the TV service there. So, I just look at this and go more and more, I think we're going to live in a Google Suite or Microsoft Teams world. And it's going to be interesting to see how that manifests itself in buyer behavior. Because at the end of the day, most sales are personal. Like at some level, right, it's usually you form a relationship with the customer. And it's going to be more interesting trying to do that via video. But I just think more and more, I mean, already people are looking at it and going, gosh, I have this whole exposure to humans, right? Like in the sense of my labor force at any point in time, I could lose 30% of them. Grocery stores are starting to look at getting robots, right? And socially, I think we're all going to have some fascinating discussions over the next couple of years about this is accelerating almost everything that's coming anyways.
Well, Amazon Go, right, was
Yeah.
the groundbreaking technology out of Seattle that allowed for those types of stores, and now they're pervasive along the west coast of America.
And even stuff like to trace the virus, we're going to move to a whole other level of surveillance that not everyone's going to be comfortable with.
Yeah.
Right. And Google and Apple are playing a very cute game right now of, hey, we can do it. It's dead easy. We're cooperating, but you have to opt in. It's going to be interesting to see to what extent the governments say there is no opting in. If you're running a cell phone in this country, that information's available, because the downside is too many people get sick or die if it isn't. So I mean, it's going to be really interesting.
So there are companies in front of our government right now, because I chatted with one of them very recently, that has that ability to track you, and it is anonymized. And in Australia yesterday, they announced a similar type of an approach, and it's an opt-in. And they had, I can't remember how many millions of people opt in immediately so that they can move forward with their lives. So I think you're absolutely right.
And if the majority signs off on that, the government will have enough shelter to make it law. And like Google, I don't know that you even need a local company doing it, right? Google and Apple have made it so easy to do that, you won't need a Canadian answer. There'll be some small number of vendors worldwide because you need to protect the security, and the cost of that is so high, and the governments will use it in one scenario, right? Like it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I do think that there has to be something that allows the governments to protect themselves and know that we are moving forward and providing a secure, healthy environment for people federally, provincially, municipally. A, because they feel an enormous responsibility, and B, politically, they don't want this to fire back on them and blow a hole in their ability to successfully mount a campaign whenever their next election is. Elena, any final thoughts on how you might have seen changes and what you think is going to change forever, either for business travel or work from home or anything at all?
Sure. So everything that's already been said, I totally agree with. I think when it comes to the work environment, we're going to see a lot of changes. I think work from home is going to become sort of part of the new normal. There's going to be some sort of a mixed flex work environment that's going to be built around this. I think many companies are going to question like massive offices that they hold. And I mean, you've seen that from big firms like the accounting and finance firms that already moved into smaller offices, and they're totally on a booking basis. So you don't even have a desk, but it's all hot desks around. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation around that. I think it's cool that there's a lot of mental health initiatives being kicked off now. I think COVID sort of accelerated that too, which was super important before, but now it's more important than ever. And I'm hoping that that stays part of the culture. So I do go on weekly HR calls with League, which is a Toronto-based startup, but they lead these calls on a weekly basis. And you see what companies are thinking about, and so much of it is about teams and about well-being. I think that's going to stay part of our sort of new normal day-to-day. Definitely less travel. I think people will think twice before traveling. Companies will probably change policies around travel, to be honest. So it's sort of like we'll drill it won't just be at like base level, it'll be all the way up to like what is our philosophy around travel in general, and footprint. All of that will come into play. So it's my opinion on that part, but I did want to make a clarification on something I said earlier, because as a founder, that was one of my bigger learnings as an early stage founder. So on your high risk employees where you don't have a lot of room for salary changes, or if you have to drop salaries and stuff, remember, I said that I would be very protective of my equity when it came to investors. I would take the opposite approach with my team. If I have a small core team, I would be giving them good chunks of equity. If these are high risk takers, to them, it's going to be so much more important that they're doing something really meaningful and they have a true upside. And I mean, if you have specific questions, I'm happy to address them offline and help you guys out, but like, don't be stingy with equity. These are the times where you want to be, you want to keep a smaller part of a big pie than have the entire pie and it's worth nothing at the end of the day. So I wanted to clarify that, because I think so many founders get so caught up in keeping as much of the equity as possible that your first, 10 hires, they're really important people. And if you truly trust them, you want to give them a good upside.
So I'm going to concur 100% that a crisis is a time of enormous change that maybe you just don't expect, right? It brings out the very, very best in people. It also showcases the worst. So this is an opportunity to truly identify and reward loyalty, to Elena's point. If you find those people that really stand and deliver, this is a time to be loyal. And if you've got a really good customer base and they stand by you, whatever your product or service is, through a period like this, and you can give them all kinds of discounts or any kind of promotions to embolden them, to keep them by your side, this is a great time to identify loyalty. And a crisis is a big time for innovation. And truly, every single crisis, there are born multiple new technologies, massive new innovations that change the way that we live, change the way that we work, change the way that we think, change the way that we relate to one another. And so that's kind of what I want to close off the call with, is this is a gut-wrenching, horrible time. And there are those very terrifying moments or weeks or months. But there are also times of opportunity. This is a time that you can position yourself for coming out of the worst of it. If, as some analysts are saying, that this is a Nike swoosh recovery, how do you position to ride that swoosh and you get to that nice runway so that your business is truly sustainable? Because those businesses that have been able to ride through this are stronger. They're richer for having had this experience, and they'll be, I think, broader and deeper as a result, and they will have immense success in the coming years. So it's a great time of loyalty, great time of innovation, great time of creativity, and truly you get to see who you can trust and who is really part of your team, whether as an investor or as an employee. I'm so sorry, I take full responsibility for going over time. But as I said at the outset, I was truly honored to have this panel. You can see why I was excited to have them. Their wisdom, their experience, their ideas, their creativity in helping you all think through some of these really difficult challenges. It's such important learning. And for us, to our alumni, to our cohorts, this is a time for us to show our commitment and our loyalty to you to help you through this very, very difficult time. Because we do recognize that this is not easy. So to everybody on our panel, thank you so much. For everybody for joining us, thank you so much. And Visha, thank you for hosting the call and all the terrific work that you've done in this crisis.